Hello, my name is Dolana Mogadime, and really want to express how happy I am to be here to talk about my mother. Her name is Goodie Tshabalala Mogadime, born in South Africa during apartheid and in the early 1930s. Someone who has become a leader in terms of educational, I guess it would be a vision during the post-apartheid era in particular. Someone that really had innovative ideas. She was called upon by different NGOs, and she also was someone, even during apartheid, who was called upon frequently to speak about apartheid. And this was during the 80s when people really were not that informed about the realities. People oftentimes believed what was they were told by the apartheid government, which was basically a kind of a propaganda trying to convince people that apartheid was separate but equal. And in fact, it was not. It was anything but that. So her work really was about truth telling, and she was invited through the United Church to different congregations, and she spoke in a way that was very or educating for people. Her background as a teacher, her graduate studies, her master's degree meant she spoke in a way that was approachable, in a way that made people have a sense of empathy and connectedness to the people and what they were undergoing on the ground. So hers was really a personal story of growing up in apartheid, and one in which she was able to have people understand what the realities were, the challenges were for people living in apartheid, and especially for children. She was a big advocate for children, of course, being a teacher herself. And yes, yeah, so it's interesting that you asked that question, obviously, because when she worked with Isabel Mason, who's a curator of the Mandela Struggle for Free exhibition, that actually was initiated with the Canadian Museum of Human Rights. That was one of the questions that she asked my mother. And it's quite telling that my mother referenced Mandela and Mandela's way in which he conveyed the clarity on the indignities that people suffered during apartheid, making people, what he said was like animals, being treated like animals. So that was one of the things that she mentioned to the curator when she was being interviewed. And of course, apartheid really dictated every aspect of a person's life. But what was exceptional about my mother's story was the fact that she came from a family. We really have a matrilineal way of understanding and respecting women in our family. So my grandmother was really very pivotal for how my mother understood her own leadership in the community. So my grandmother was a businesswoman. She was someone that was very influenced by this idea of self-reliance. So my grandmother's father's brother was in Samung, and the Samung who my mother became very close to was Henry Selby in Samung. He was one of the founding fathers of the ANC. And the stories my mother tells me of that kindred spirit that my grandmother and Selby shared was one that facilitated that critical understanding about the role of how educated people in South Africa, because they were the group of people that were Christianized, the group of people that infuse their culture into Christianity. So they Africanized Christianity. That's an interesting way of thinking about spirituality. So as a result of that whole lineage of a sense of your education being a pivotal piece of you then using that education to serve the community, to uplift the community was something that I think my mother was socialized to understand what her role would be. And so then my grandmother as well, there was that kind of reciprocal understanding about women's leadership, self reliance, a sense of using their education to support their communities. That's a way of understanding that my mother grew up with. And I can't tell you about my mother without telling you about Esther Dudu Tshabalala, who was her own mother, because there was that synergy between them that really did lead the way in self definitions, a sense of purpose that they shared between them, and she shared with me. It was very pivotal for my mother in the way she grew up in terms of who she was surrounded with, and her sense of what her responsibilities were to her country. So she had a real sense of wanting to reconnect when we came to Canada. We were forced to leave, come here as exiles. And so after some time in Canada, she wanted to reconnect. She wanted to get back to her country of birth. And so the reason being her socialization that she went through and her own people's activism. Being born in the 30s, going through the school system herself, and she attended Ananda Seminary School, which was a mission-run private girls' school. And through that education, they learned certain principles, like you have to, quote unquote, lift as you climb. So that means this interdependent notion of giving back to your community. Because my grandmother was a businesswoman, and because she came from this very affluent family, she was able to pay the fees for my mother to go to that private school for girls. But it was at that school where they learned certain principles of like leadership. They were very involved in this idea of developing your whole self, or your potential. She used to participate a lot in the arts. She loved singing. She was a opera singer, and that also gave her a sense of presence, this idea that she had certain talents that she was building as a young woman. And so then taking that into her notion of what she can do as a woman was really important. So that's one thing. The other thing I want to point out is that she was also with other young women too, whose fathers were very active in the movement, the liberation movement. And one of them became a very close friend of hers too. And her name is I call her Auntie Tandeka Kabashe. She went on and she married my mother's first cousin, Tulane Kabashe. They had 4 children, and in the late 1960s, early 70s, after her father's death, she fled South Africa with her family to Atlanta, Georgia, where they stayed in exile for decades. In Atlanta, she became a beacon for the anti-apartheid liberation movement by taking on the role as director of the Southern Peace Education Program of the American Friends Service Committee in Atlanta. She maintained that role for about 15 years. She took part in anti-apartheid organizations in the United States, such as the American Committee on Africa, in New York City, and Congress, at both cultural and educational institutions, until she returned to South Africa in 1996. She then became an ambassador through the Department of Foreign Affairs in 1998. As a result of her steadfast and tireless work, she was awarded an honorary doctorate, as well as many other awards. So, for instance, through the International Black Women's Congress, the Civil Liberation Award, and the Civil Liberties Union of Georgia Award. But her father was Chief Albert Lutuli, and Chief Albert Lutuli was the first Black man to ever receive a Nobel Prize for Peace. And he became president of the ANC. And so my mother grew up being very close friends with Tandeka, and she'd go over and she would visit Tandeka's home on the holidays. And what I came to know is she learned about politics with the company of Chief Albert Lutuli. And she told me at the feet of Albert Lutuli, he would tell her about politics, of what was going on in South Africa. So that was her own part of her conscientization, or critical conscientization of the country and how apartheid was affecting everyday people in their lives and limiting them in severe ways. And so part of the way my grandmother grew up, my mother, was a sense of education. We've got to educate in order so that we can then instill and support others. And so then my mother went on to university, and at that university she studied history, and that was also part of her. She attended the same university that Nelson Mandela did, and of course later in life. But the notion was it was the only Black university in South Africa at the time. And so it was also a site of a lot of politicization amongst students. And so her educational biography was really an important part of how she got to understand what her role would be in society moving forward. So she and my father married in the 50s. They had their children, and then in the 60s they left South Africa for Zambia. And then from Botswana and Zambia, then we moved eventually to Canada in the early 70s. So she became very involved with different NGOs. She worked with Miles for Millions. She worked with different groups such as World Council of Churches. And she was also very involved with women's organizations. She was also someone that had a lot of friends that were also very politically active. Kay Livingston was one of them. She's became very influential at the governmental level. She's actually the one that coined the phrase visible minorities. Kay Livingston's very influential Black woman. When she arrived, was invited by a lot of different women's organizations to again talk about apartheid, talk about what was going on in South Africa. And then from there, she connected with the ANC office. And then the ANC required for her to do talks. And so then they were the ones that invited her to go to the churches in particular, talk to people about what was going on in South Africa, and be a spokesperson, really, to try and raise funds and to do a conscientization or critical uplifting of people's understandings about apartheid, which was a really important part of social change. And so then she became very involved with the anti-apartheid movement that way, and was involved with different types of campaigns, the disinvestment campaign. And yeah, that was her work was really much embedded in being active with the ANC as well. Whose work really was to again raise awareness about what's going on in South Africa and do different types of campaigns for disinvestment and political awareness raising about South Africa as well. It's an act of bravery just to leave your country. Although for my parents, they didn't feel like they had a choice; they had to. And to come to Canada, I think was faced with discrimination. My father, I think, had a harder time, maybe because of the being a doctor, what he faced. My mother did have a sense of her purpose. She was very strongly embedded in this idea that especially her right to fully self actualize her true potential. She was just very much taught that in growing up. And so she did do all kinds of things. And she did her qualifications to become a teacher in Canada, but she also did her master's degree. She had aspirations to become a school principal for leadership. And this was at a time where there were not a lot of Black women teachers to begin with. So the fact that she wanted to become a school principal was very unusual. And so there was a bar that was set. It's very difficult for her to go past that bar. So she had a number of situations where she was actually, constrained and wasn't able to do what she wanted to do. And so I think in some ways she instilled a vision within me to excel as much as I can, because in some ways she wasn't able to. And that's only because of the times. Being a Black woman in the 70s in a school system, teaching in a very white profession where she was only a handful of Black people in her school board at that time. The notion that she could aspire to be a leader was unheard of. And she wasn't really accepted in that way. So, and then this is when she actually started to redefine what she would do because of, and then this is when she, and then that was in the 80s, she decided, okay, I want to go back home and I want to give back to my people. And it was through education. She wrote her books that came out of her graduate studies and her understanding about children. She specialized in guidance education. So her books, she wrote a book that was based on guidance education. And then when she went to South Africa, she was able to use that book and to promote this idea of what she believed in around developing the creativity of every child, the child's innate intelligence, the need for teachers to support and develop that intelligence, which was in absolute reverse of the Bantu Education Act, which was really about limiting young Black people's true potential. Bantu Education Act was also one of the reasons my parents wanted to leave because in 1953 that act was imposed so that it would deliver a different education to Black children than it would white children. It would limit them in ways that it was said to for them to prepare for their lot as subservient people in the society. It was a form of education that also, as it went forward to in the 1970s, which is why the 1976 student uprising happened, was because not only was Bantu education put into place, but then there was a sense that the students and the children would have to learn Afrikaans. And Afrikaans was the language of the oppressor. And so to be forced to learn that language was very oppressive. So this is one of the reasons why the children, went on strike and refused to be educated under those provisions. They actually took part in walking out intentionally, not attending school because of these restrictions that were imposed on their education. And of course, we know in 1976, with the students becoming more visibly active, that led to a more people being incensed with the outcome of children being targeted and shot down and killed. And I think that in the 70s in particular, I think for the first time people realized how children were being treated. And I think it really did lead to more of an awareness amongst people as well. They were, I think, outraged at what was happening. Children being gunned down and seeing tanks in the townships. And education has always been a huge source of activism for our family and for my mother. Eventually, after doing her books in the 80s, then worked with some of the Rotary Club, very elite white club, but she worked with them and also the Ministry of Education at that time, and they together developed a new approach to education. And Peter Marisburg Community College was something that she actually initiated, and in the late 1980s, and then she went back and opened the college. And so she took 6 months off from her teaching in Canada to do that. And that was quite a monumental endeavor to do that work. We just recently found out that Black history is being mandated in Ontario. So all teachers will now need to have it taught in their programs. I developed a set of support materials for teachers. I'm really so thrilled through a eCampus Ontario initiative that makes the book available to the world. And I developed a set of lessons. But the book itself is called Mandela Global Human Rights, Peace, Reconciliation, and Responsibility. And I published it in 2023. And so there was a group of us that worked together, but I was the editor of it. And in that book is a set of lessons that I've put together for my mother. And they're based on the oral history interview that my mother did with the curator, Isabel Mason, that I mentioned earlier, who's at the Canadian Museum of Human Rights. She was the one that develop the Mandela Struggle for Freedom exhibition. So they allowed me to use the interview. And so from that, I developed a set of lessons that take place over 10 days that can be used for grade 10 civics and grade 11 open. In it features my mother's work, so Caroline Goodie Mogadime's contributions to things like featuring the actual work that she did. So newspaper articles, the work she did in the churches. I look at primary sources, primary documents, which is part of the oral history process. And so just to, maybe I'll just read a little bit about it here. The students are introduced to the idea of oral history as a historical inquiry. It's useful for cross-disciplines. Oral history support essay writing and history in the social sciences, the humanities, gender studies, social justice, and human rights. So the oral history interview that I include means that students can do their own inquiries. They can look at additional materials to support the oral history. They can look at incorporating editorial pieces. They can look at topics that are raised during the interview itself, conduct searches on things like boycotts that happened during the anti-apartheid movement. An example being the boycott on batter shoes, or boycotts on Shell, or different types of companies that were part of the disinvestment movement during the anti-apartheid era. And so in and through those 10 days, students are exposed to the history of activism. So celebrating the work of someone like my mother, who was an activist, and also looking at the ways in which she participated in political change, but what was occurring in Canada, her being amid that larger anti-apartheid movement, and it being something that students then can do research on, and then they can become aware of the role of Canadians in supporting political change, especially around social justice. So that's one of the things that I have that I'm very grateful for, that's now accessible to all students anywhere in the world. And I'm hoping that they will dive into those lessons that I developed for my mother, about my mother and about her work, but more the work of Black women in their own communities making change is what's really critical here. This idea that, of being a citizen with full rights to exercise that political change is really important for students, I think, to know, to see examples of that and positive examples of that. And it's coming from Black people themselves, that they are part and parcel of their own emancipation. That's really important for students to know and to appreciate. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that I'm hoping to put together some of the various pieces that I've used when I did my mother's oral history. When I did my master's degree, it was focused on praise poetry and her life history. I'm hoping to bring together some of those pieces I collected for my master's degree and put it into an archive and dedicate it to her and to her activism, and how that's demonstrated through letters that she received from, say, for instance, when she was invited to go to a refugee school in Tanzania. And she was invited in order to participate in a vision for what was at that time called the New South Africa. And then she went there and she met refugee youth. And she really did take that role of being another mother to them. And it was through that connectedness, a sense of being what was called in the research literature, this notion about being a community other mother, was why that became very pivotal for her to then envision what she can do for youth so they can become reoriented during the time of freedom, which was the 1994, when she had started that community college. And so it was really around going full circle, serving the youth that were disenfranchised and wanting to do something that would support their education. And so the community college was part of that. And so I'm just hoping that to bring together all of those pieces in an archive and have that available for people that want to do research on Black women and with Black women's leadership. I think the big one is recognition of Black women and their incredible talents, their insights into their communities, and their ability to have rich sources of knowledge that would support their community's growth, and to look to them for solutions and for any kind of issues that people are working on, to consult with women, Black women especially, on what can be done. And so when it comes to any kind of initiative, as I said, with this introduction of Black history is mandated in Ontario, one might think that's great, but my question is then, what kinds of materials are going to be used? And is this going to be a source of including Black people's own voices in representing their own communities? The authentic nature of an understanding from within the community needs to be honored and respected as we learn about Black history. And so I think we need to turn to Black women to be partners in terms of implementing a new mandate that's coming from the Ministry of Education, for instance.